And so I've started that. And let me see if I can share my screen with you all
Yeah.
right here. Can you see that?
Yes, we
Yeah, well,
can.
yours is going to be great with the pictures.
Yeah.
Yours was good, Marcia. Don't feel bad. We enjoyed it.
Yes, we did.
Thank you.
Well, so yeah, we'll continue on our conversation about Celtic Christianity and just what it is. Yeah, as Marcia laid out last week, it's the Celtic um, communities spread all throughout continental Europe, all the way into areas around Turkey, modern day Turkey, and maybe even a little beyond that, as reflected in their folklore. The letter to the Galatians, of course, is to um, Celtic people um, by Paul. Um, but we're interested in, let me get this to play, um, these folks that were in modern day United Kingdom. What's drawn in there is Hadrian's Wall.
Mhm.
And that was the furthest extent of the Roman civilization, basically, before its collapse. And so that is a significant kind of line of demarcation between people south of there that have been exposed to Christianity and people north of there that were still regarded as barbarians and to be avoided at all costs. Um, St. Patrick, when he was born, lived close to the wall, someplace up in that community. And when he was snatched by um, slave traders, he was taken into Ireland from there, which will be significant in just a little bit. But you can still see the wall. You can walk along it today. So it was quite a fortification. Um, this time of what's called Celtic Christianity really is this period after the Romans leave, like 411 in the Common Era, um, up until at least 664, which is the Synod of Whitby, where kind of Roman Christian influences are kind of reestablished in the area, but don't really come to dominate until about 800 of the Christian era. So it's this time where some of the influences of Christian, not just missionaries, but in the first and second centuries, just Christians themselves who had been up into the UK kind of area that had influenced things, and um, uh, and then some of the missionary activity that takes place after the Romans leave, where they're really left to themselves to answer the questions of what the scripture means. Let's see, I'm going to try to, Marsha, are you able to let in somebody maybe has.
Yeah, I just did. I just did. Can you hear us, the person on the phone?
Hello? Okay. So this is a very basic timeline, just showing you where some of these people fall, beginning with Pelagius, who is a contemporary of St. Augustine and actually went to Rome and eventually was labeled a heretic. But then following on St. Patrick, who is one of the first missionaries into the area, north of Hadrian's Wall. Everyone thought it was a mistake. He even apologized for it many times, and his work was converting a lot of the slaves north of the wall. And Columba, who was a founder of the Iona community, who himself had been part of the kind of warlord kind of community. And I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a bit. But then some of you might be more familiar with the Book of Kells, which was probably developed in Iona. It was very ornate set of gospels, and then a very profound theologian, John Scotus, who around that 800 CE time period. Trying to get this to switch pages here. This is one of the outposts, Caleb Michael, that survived until about the 1200s. So it was one of the places where Celtic Christianity continued even into the early medieval times. This is an island many miles off the coast of the southwestern Ireland. And it's this rocky island where they survived on puffin eggs and some other things that could grow there. It's now abandoned.
What's a skellig?
Skellig means rock, I think. Big rock.
Okay.
Part of what makes Celtic Christianity interesting and different from the Roman tradition were these kind of confluence of influences that were kind of what was already there in the Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, and that allowed them to have this sort of fresh take on the Bible. Of course, number one is just the Celtic culture itself, that it prized oral wisdom tradition. It was very elaborate with the Druidic sort of scholars and mystics. They prized people in their community that they would call bards, who would tell the stories, keep the stories of the communities, that were gifted storytellers and good public speakers. And of course, also lawyers. They did a lot of training and education, but they didn't write anything down. So we don't know a lot about them now. But there is some of the Celtic folklore that kind of survives to this current day. And there's stories of gods, kind of like the Greek gods. Also, though, seem to be influenced by Mithra, and drawing from Persia. So that's reflecting the great sort of geographical extent to which the Celtic civilization is too strong a word, but the band of Celtic peoples was exposed to these things from very early on. And it wasn't that people migrated to Scotland and Wales, being driven there by Roman armies. It was more that Rome basically took over all these other territories, and all that remained sort of unstained or unconquered was that little spot in Scotland above Hadrian's Wall. So they were people in Scotland and Wales were there and Ireland for from time immemorial, going back to Neolithic peoples that seem to be somewhat different. But specifically, there's a character named Lug, and the daughter of Lug, which is Brigid. Lug was was a human figure who was reborn. He's resurrected. He unites. He's a disparate peoples. Also unites the dark and the light, and he tries to lead to the flourishing of the people. And Brigid is the daughter of Lug. These figures in the Celtic folklore sound a lot like somebody that'll come later, Jesus Christ, which is part of why Celtic Christianity, Celtic culture was so receptive to Christianity. They also, I think, famously are very close to the earth, and particularly holy places were in gatherings of trees, and the world seemed very naturally populated with sort of magical creatures and fairies and Mother Earth personified. Another thing that characterizes Celtic culture wherever it's found is really extraordinary craftsmanship, a very high level of artistry, and sort of abstract in geographical geometric patterns, and in a sense, not knowing, you have to sort of do a double take to know what you're looking at a lot of the time, where something like an animal turns into a human, or and then also relating to the natural world and the the directions of northeast, south, and west, and circles and things like that. But the other thing that was very much a factor in that part of the daily life in Scotland and Ireland was that it was dominated by warlords. There were 150 warlords, all of whom were in agreement that there were 149 too many warlords. They all wanted to be in charge. And slave trading was something common, and polygamy was very fraught and very contentious time there. So when Christianity sort of emerges, one of the things that Christianity adds, in addition to the Christian gospel, is a new technology, and that is just writing, the written word. That is something that will be embraced by these first Christian communities. And the other is these monastic traditions, and inspired by the desert fathers of Egypt. It's not certain that there ever was a direct connection where people traveled between Egypt and the Hebrides, or Scotland, but there was extensive traveling, from these remote little island posts. You have to remember that the ocean was sort of the highway of the time. So there was a lot of trading and a lot of interaction. But these desert traditions were inspirational partly because of all the warring conflict people found it very appealing to be able to step away from that, to retreat from the world, um, uh, and they thought of the ocean, despite it being a highway, as a sort of desert that they could be surrounded by and create their own sort of peaceful communities. Um, um, so when these strands of Celtic culture and Christian gospel start to interact, um, it's a very friendly encounter. There's a lot of overlap, even including in traditions around patterns of three and resurrection, and a sense of a Messiah that is born again and invites us into new life. Christian missionaries, including St. Patrick and whatnot, didn't use force. It's very much in contrast to missionary activity almost everywhere else in the world and throughout history. Not like the Spanish Inquisition, in part because they were converting themselves. These are Celtic people. Like St. Patrick and Columba. Columba is the son of a warlord from Ireland who feels kind of ashamed and convicted by his involvement in war and sails north and makes sure that he's good far enough south that he cannot see Ireland on the horizon. He cannot see home. And the Iona community in the Hebrides is this island that's on the end of a long peninsula out in the middle of the water. So this idea of this sort of cloistered monastic life, not maybe like Western monasticism that you might think of, that characterized like Saint Benedict, but more of this hermitage type monastic community. So it's another point there is that it's not Christian communities formed by priests. It's not by clerical leaders, but by monastic leaders. And the principal task of these monastic communities like Iona was intercessory prayer as compared to preaching. They were the service they provided was to pray for everyone, and that was what would was beneficial for the whole community, and that they would get compensation from warlords and such for those prayers. And the other thing they devoted themselves very much to was copying the Psalms in Latin, this mysterious language that nobody knew. It wasn't something they grew up speaking. But for the first long while, they're just copying things that they've inherited. And what comes later would be reflecting on scripture from their own Celtic tradition. What does this Bible say? What does this gospel mean? And there's nobody around to ask but themselves. Had there been Roman authorities to tell them, they probably would have gone along with it. I don't think Celtic Christianity didn't set out to be different. They just did what they thought made sense. So, so any questions so far or comments?
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting about the monastic communities, and that makes sense where the Book of Kells and all that other beautiful stuff came from. But the source I read about monastic communities had a very different picture, so I don't know if he was wrong or if they were both or they were just one kind and then the other. But he talked about when Patrick came, um, he started these communities that were much more like a commune. All sorts of people lived in them. They were very supportive of one another. They welcomed people in, and it was like a little town, all, you know, helping one another.
Right. And there's place names of all these communities throughout Ireland and other places that reflect those kinds of home church type communities. So that's right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So that's a different kind of, or that was a different movement in addition to what you were talking about then. Is that right?
Well, yeah. I mean, what becomes the place that produces the things that we remember, including some of this theology, comes from places like Iona and the Holy Island of, oh, I always forget the name of it, on the other side of Scotland.
Lindisfarne?
Yeah,
Lindisfarne.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The only other comment I would make is, I've seen comments that the sort of origin of the Celtic tribes is Turkey, basically. And that would explain both Greek and Persian influences because they would have had them. But I think they left there somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 years ago. So,
Right. Right. So, I mean, this is based on some a scholar that is reading Celtic folklore, and again, these are oral traditions, so we don't have exactly what the originals were. But as these early Christian communities begin to learn writing, and they start to write down some of their own prayers, and they write down some of their stories, and they're probably modified in some way that that we're not going. I certainly don't know, um, but just analyzing that folklore, it seems to be inspired by, or at least very, it follows patterns of Greek and Persian gods, um, but in their own way. And I'm certainly not enough of a scholar or read enough to be able to speak intelligently about it beyond saying that. Um, yeah, there was an enormous geographical sweep of Celtic communities, and that seems to be reflected in this folklore, which was part of the backdrop for Christianity as it enters into Scotland and Ireland and those communities. Um, so this next slide is, you say potato, I say potato. And just to kind of read, I think that Celtic Christianity, despite the fact that Pelagius was labeled a heretic, it's still, I would say it's safely within the bounds of apollisticity, that is, faithful witness to the Christian tradition, but it's certainly a little bit different. And it's not so much that I want to say that they fundamentally disagree, or like Celtic Christianity is just something entirely different than Roman Christianity. But I think it's largely a point of emphasis. And I mean, so this first point, I mean, just this is just an observation that that there was this veneration for the earth, and so Mary becomes very identified with all the kind of Celtic thoughts about Mother Earth personified. It's also connected to Bridget in the folklore, the daughter of Lugh. Um, uh, um, and to my potato sort of point, I think it becomes a little easier to see with some of these other things. You know, original sin is a doctrine that is developed first by Saint Augustine, who was a contemporary of Pelagius. Um, uh, and Pelagius is famously associated with original blessing. So when you look at the book of Genesis, what comes first? Is it that God created the world and called it good? Or is it that Adam and Eve um, um, ate from the fruit of the tree of good and evil? Lutherans are very clear that by by grace alone we are saved, and so that we're steeped in sin, and we're sort of mired in it. But grace is the point about original blessing would be that that grace is something that's part of the just what is that God freely and abundantly pours out into the world, and so it's always on offer. Whereas original sin was a very useful kind of doctrine for the Roman Church, because they wanted to argue that without access to the Christian sacraments and the Christian church, that there was no escape from that sin. And so it gave them a way to control the access to grace. Whereas in the kind of Celtic Christian way of thinking, that grace is accessible everywhere to everyone. Let's see if I can get this to. In Roman tradition, there's more of this emphasis than on orthodoxy, like that is right beliefs, get your beliefs in order. Whereas in the Celtic tradition, there's more of a emphasis on right living, orthopraxy, that God's this gospel calls us to live and be in community in different ways than would naturally come to us, to live out of sense of love and mutual respect, and not so much what you think. There is Roman Christianity would not want to consider itself dualistic, but nevertheless there is kind of within that Roman tradition, we say Christ is both human and divine, but there somehow has grown up in Roman thinking that there's sort of a division there, and that even though we have an incarnational theology, it's been part of that flavor of Roman Christianity where there's a division between things of the flesh and things of this world and things of the spirit and things of heaven. Whereas in the Celtic tradition, there's more of a close, there's maybe it's a spectrum, but there's that things of this world and things of heaven are um, are not divided. They're not separate things, but they're kind of expressions of the same thing. And I didn't know what to label. It's a creation, some of these creation stories. I'm just referring to uh, uh, where God has created heaven and earth. That's affirmed in the Roman tradition. But again, we seem determined to leave this world behind and get to heaven as fast as we can, or make sure that we can get into heaven. And in the Celtic tradition, there's this sense of panentheism, that all things are created of God, that God is in all things, but not that God is all things. So panentheism means God in all things, not that God is all things. But it creates a kind of a way of living out our faith that is something called enchanted, that the natural world, the things around us reflect God's glory. And there's certainly in the teachings of Paul, and in Romans and other places, and the Psalms, there's a sense that God is proclaimed by trees and rocks and mountains and animals, and beasts of the field, that God is there. I can stop again. Any clarifying questions? I mean, that's rather general, perhaps, but it helps me get a picture of kind of what the point of emphasis of what's distinctive about Celtic Christianity, but not utterly different.
It looks like a good summary to me from what I know. Not that I'm an expert, but that's helpful.
Okay. So just to stay a little bit more on this subject, but with regard to one person, Pelagius, who was kind of one of the very early persons, 354 to 418. So just probably died sometime after the withdrawal of the Romans from Britain. One of the things that he wanted to assert is the freedom of the human will, and that how God has created the world involves human freedom, and that the capacity to do evil is itself something that is good, that God creates independent kind of creatures, and that the human conscience is an example, as evidence of God's grace. And again, this idea of the universality of grace, that even people who are not Christian or don't share any knowledge of Christ can still reflect the virtues of Christ. Luther famously said that whatever preaches Christ is the gospel, regardless who said it, whether it be Judas or a Roman centurion or Pilate. And whatever doesn't preach Christ is not the gospel, even if Paul or Peter said it or preached it. And so there's this sense of kind of Christ consciousness that is reflective of how the world is created and how everything in it works. And it kind of draws upon the Gospel of John, In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Not one thing is made outside of that logos in Christ. And again, these are picking up, these kinds of themes are probably, you hear them, they're ascending in contemporary Christianity, I think. Other thoughts there?
I think I'm Celtic, but that's my conclusion. More than Lutheran.
Very attractive. Do you think
Yeah.
that the idea of non-Christians and atheists may reflect the virtues of Christ? Do you think that's what got him in trouble with the Roman Church? Because it would seem like they wouldn't like that particularly.
I think it was, that doctrine of original sin. You know, the church becoming a state religion, getting kind of mixed up with the power of the state. It was very, so I will just say self-serving to have this doctrine of original sin where interpreted to mean that you cannot get right with God, or God is not going to have anything to do with your life. You're going to be condemned to hell unless you come to us, to this church, and partake in these sacraments. It gave them the franchise, as compared to an emphasis on original blessing, which says, yes, the church, the gospel, these sacraments are important and revelatory signs of God's grace that is always already everywhere present. It's a little bit less compelling. It undermines the authority of the church in a time when they were trying to cement their authority. So I think that the fact that it was a state religion, it was a very kind of critical piece for why they promoted the uniformity across the whole, all of Christendom, everywhere that Roman civilization touched. It was so important to have that orthodoxy. But for a few, there are just a few examples where Christian tradition flourished a little bit independently and got this other flavor there. And I'd say contemporary times is another sort of flourishing, because we're not so bound by more recent Christian traditions, but looking to go back to the beginning, and we can read the scriptures and know the languages and know about the culture of the original, the settings of the Gospels, to be able to have some confidence that we can interpret their meaning better than people did at, say, 1000 AD or 1200 AD, or even back to St. Augustine, and I don't know, that I just launched into a whole bunch of something there. All right, so
if I may interject something here, this is Richard. I've been having technical difficulties getting into Zoom today, but this last week I was reading a book that made kind of an oblique reference to Celtic Christianity, and suggested, though certainly didn't prove it, that there may be some continuities between Celtic Christianity and certain forms of Protestantism in Northern Europe. I don't know quite what to make of that, because certainly if you divide the world into Celtic and Roman Christianity, I think Luther, as an Augustinian monk, was probably more part of the Roman. Anyway, it was kind of an interesting idea that some of this, some of the aspects of Celtic Christianity did carry over into parts of the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, I mean, even like the writings of Pelagius would have been destroyed, except that somebody labeled them as writings of Jerome, Saint Jerome, who was one of the heroes of the Roman Church. So somebody early on was up to some mischief, and so some of Pelagius' writings were preserved. Duns Scotus, John Scotus in 800s was very influential beyond Great Britain. Is part of influential in like the rise of like Charlemagne's court as the Europe emerges from the Dark Ages. There are other kind of mystic, Christian mystic kind of traditions that seem to have some echoes and resonance. And again, it's not to say that sin isn't a problem. Grace is, but for grace, we would all be lost. But it's to kind of be clear on how that grace works in the world. I don't think Luther, I don't know that there's any evidence that Luther had direct contact with Celtic Christianity, but I don't think that there's something about Celtic Christianity that can't fit or with our Protestant traditions. It does lend a different flavor to it, however, I think.
I just might comment, I don't know if this is a valid idea or not, but at least for further north in the Scandinavian countries, they ended up conquering some things that and certainly having a lot of interactions with Celts during the Viking era, and then would have brought that maybe back to Scandinavia. I don't know if they did or not, but it's certainly a possibility there. After all, Dublin, for example, was a Viking town originally.
Yeah, well, I mean, places like Iona were places of extraordinary learning and actually had access to some of the classical texts and libraries of ancient Rome or Greece. But for their preservation of those documents and therefore their interpretation of them, those things would have been lost largely to history. So that's an example of the influence of Celtic Christianity to the rebirth of Europe and Western civilization. There were other places like, I guess, in Spain and Toledo, I don't know. There are other places that began to be sources for our ancient Western civilization texts, classical texts, but one of the first of them was the Celtic Christians. I don't know, Richard, do you have any more to say about that? Or
I'm sorry, Pastor.
I was any other comments on that?
Well, not really. I was just going to say, though, about I see the Pelagius screen is still up. Pelagianism does not go away with condemnation of Pelagius, of course. It's interesting that some of the big debates in the 19th century, American theology, most of which we can't make much sense out of, a lot of it had to do with arguments over Pelagius, and the Methodists were often accused of being Pelagian because they did not hold to the strict Calvinist doctrines. So, Pelagius 1,500 years ago is probably still, even though we may not know his name, still very much a subject of debate.
Yeah. Well, and even in our own lifetimes, the church was, I think, some years ago in my youth, was very uncomfortable saying that somebody could be right with God and not officially, formally become Christian.
I always think of Paul Tillich's comment, who was, I think, in many ways, perhaps a German idealistic Pelagian. His comment that there really are no atheists, because the way he defined atheism was a person who had no ultimate concern about anything. And so he was very comfortable dealing with so-called atheists in the modern world.
Well, let's see here. I'm going to see what time it is. 11:54. Some other things that I have here, didn't really talk too much about some of the women that were leaders in the Celtic Christian community. I don't want to say they're treated fully equally. I guess I don't know a lot about that, but they certainly were recognized. The one thing to know too is that Celtic Christianity is still at a time when the I'm sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once. Even priests in the Western tradition were not could marry and not celibate necessarily. Another thing we didn't talk about is this tradition of kind of soul friends, whereby it was important to identify another person, another Christian that could be a confessor, or we could be kind of counseling each other, encouraging each other. Some of what I heard though too is that we not to kind of idolize the Celtic Christian time period. There was a lot of still privilege to those that were in monastic communities, and they didn't were priesthood of all believers wasn't an idea that really had taken root, although there was kind of in contrast to like the Roman tradition, definitely more of a spread of including those that really wanted to be monastic or wanted to be good Christians, but hadn't really taken the vows, and that it was still a place that was defined by violence, war, the fights between warlords and that kinds of thing. I thought I would, if there are any other thoughts, I'd finish with just this hymn that's in our Lutheran Book of Worship, Be Thou My Vision, which comes to us from the Irish Celtic period, 8th, 10th century. And at least one place I heard that it is it was inspired or adapted from some writings from the Egyptian desert fathers and mothers. I don't know which one specifically, but it draws that that kind of thread from those 2nd and 3rd century Egyptian monastic communities out in the deserts around Alexandria and north of Cairo, together with those communities in Iona and other places. I don't know if we want to try to sing it or you can see it. We don't have Brad with us this time.
I think we should point out, though, that the Celtic monasticism was in many ways an adaptation or highly influenced by the Egyptian Desert Fathers. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a kind of a long-standing tradition. Takes lots of side roads and quirks, but I think there's a direct relationship there.
Yeah, it seems that at least, though they may never have traveled between those communities, there was some of the writings of Saint Anthony and other
Saint Procopius, I think, is probably the most noted one in terms of writing.
They had these writings, and they were very intimately familiar with them, and were inspired to imitate those desert communities. Yeah. Well, I mean, so that's what I had.
Well, that's been very
very
nice. Really very interesting, Monte.
Yeah.
What's your plan? Because I understand you're hoping for a sabbatical next summer, I guess it is, and where you want to work on some of this type of thing, or?
Yeah. So I did submit an application for sabbatical and I don't know if I should stop the recording.
Okay.
Maybe I'll stop the recording.
Okay.
Let's see. Stop. There it is. Okay. So I have applied to the Lilly Foundation. Screen sharing has stopped. Okay. Stop recording.